Okay, we've learned about two different sort of basic techniques for rigging up limbs. That is, jointing separated layers and then building an IK chain with Duix IK script. Or treating the limb as one layer and applying the puppet tool, turning the puppet pins into nulls using the bone script in Duix, and then again add IK with Duix IK script. But the important thing to understand about rigging in general is that there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. And you're going to have lots of cases where a 100% puppet tool solution is not going to get you what you need, or a 100% jointing situation isn't going to get you what you need. And so you have to combine the techniques together. We're going to look at two sort of opposing combination rigs, either having the upper arm and the lower arm puppet tooled with a jointed wrist and hand, or having a jointed upper arm and lower arm and a puppet tooled wrist and hand. Both of these are going to give a mixture of pros and cons, just like all of our techniques. But there's going to be times when these combinations are going to do a much better job than simply choosing one technique over another. So if you recall in the first arm video, we looked at a 100% puppet tooled arm, and there were some disadvantages. There was some distortion of the artwork that was somewhat unpleasant. And we talked also about how you may want to have a kind of soft, rounded curvature to your arms as a stylistic choice, a rubber hose style rather than a crisp elbow or knee. It's a very charming style with certain character designs and certain animation styles. So here I have rigged up one of those 100% puppet tooled arms, and we can see again what the problems are. We have pretty bad pinching here in the elbow, we have some pinching here in the wrist, and if I rotate this hand, I get some very weird kinds of movements and distortions and things. Now this arm on the other side, I've rigged using a combination technique where the upper arm is a puppet tool rig, but the wrist and the hand are jointed. And hey, look at that. That's looking a lot better, isn't it? Because the puppet tool doesn't have to bend at both the elbow and the wrist. We're stressing that whole mesh out quite a bit less. Let's zoom in a little bit here. And we should turn the resolution down here. We've got the resolution up too high. And if I rotate here, you'll see that we're not getting any weird counter movement on that upper and lower arm. It jiggled there for a bit, but that was rendering issues, not actual wiggle in the puppet. So you can see now we have a much wider range of motion here without getting weird movement that we don't want in the arm. Plus, we're getting this really, really nice round curve to this arm. Now, this is not entirely just a straight puppet tool job here to get this nice curvature. I've added some starch here in order to soften this curve. Let's take a quick look at that, and then we'll build one of these. So I'm going to unshy these layers really quick, and we're going to scroll down to the arm artwork layer here, and let's grab our starch tool so we can see how this starch works. So you can see that what we've got is a big blob of starch right in the middle, and if I select that starch, you'll see that the amount is extremely low. 0.05. Okay, so very, very low amount of starch with an extent that just kind of covers that whole middle area. And here, if we just turn this to 0, you can see the difference. Whoa, pinchy time, right? So there's the idea that with just a tiny bit of very, very light starch squirted right in the middle, and a combination joint rather than puppet tooling all the way down the arm, and we've got a pretty nice rubber hose rig here that has a much greater range of motion in which it still looks good. There's some starching here too. I tried to get rid of as much of that pinch as I could, but let's take a look here at that one. And you can see that I did the same thing. I put a blob of low starch. Notice I had to go even lower here though. I went to 0.02, which is almost nothing. And still I couldn't get rid of the pinch. It's a little bit better than it was. If we remove the starch entirely, you can see that pinch gets quite a bit worse. But I couldn't get rid of it entirely. And again, it's because there's just too much stress on this mesh in order for it to really deform in a positive way. So let's actually build one of these combination rigs so you guys can see the parenting structure. Now it's important to point out that we could just as easily starch this for a crisp elbow as well if you still wanted the benefits and advantages of that puppet tool arm, the stretching, the bending of the artwork, and then still have a jointed wrist in order to, again, take some stress off of that mesh. So just because I'm showing this as a good technique for rubber hose, be just as easy to starch this up with a crisp joint. And that's something in general I really want you to take away from this course. There's no way I could show you every possibility. I'm trying to show you lots of possibilities and a lot of techniques, and hopefully you'll start to see how you can combine and mix and match these different techniques to get the rig you need. So let's take a look at this orange man here, and let's build a combo rig for one of his arms. And this is a character that definitely cries out for some puppet tooling in the arms. He definitely should have some stretching. He should probably be a little bit rubber hose-like, probably not crisp elbows. So this is a really good candidate for doing a combination puppet tool arm and jointed hand and wrist. So let's get started. I'm going to clear these guides. We really don't need those, so I'm going to quick clear those guides out. Let's focus on his right arm here. So let's first solo this artwork so we can just focus on that arm. And then let's grab some markers because we're going to need to set some anchor points here. So I'm going to go into the marker comp and grab those and paste those in. But let's turn these to a multiply or something transparent. Maybe turn their opacity down a little. There we go. And then let's lock those. And let's start by placing some anchor points. Okay, notice that the arm is a single layer. There's no elbow or upper and lower arm piece. It's just one large piece there. So for the arm, we want the anchor point, of course, up at the shoulder. I actually find that anchor point. There he is. I'm going to hold down the command key and snap that. Now these aren't perfect circles. They were just sketched in. But it's probably a really good place to start. And if we need to make any adjustments to the anchor point, we can. And then the hand, which is this piece here, we of course want that anchor point at the wrist, so let's bring that down, hold down command and snap that in place. Then we're going to turn these markers off and let's focus on these fingers one by one here. I'll just solo one finger at a time. Now maybe we should just make a quick note of where that hand is. Okay, so we can pretty much just joint these right at the base. All right, whoops, let's solo those again. We don't need to look at the whole guy. We've got our anchor points in place, and we always want to do that whether we're using the puppet tool or not. It's a pretty good idea to just get that happening right away. Now, because we're sort of combining the puppet tool with the jointing, we want to place our pins in the same position as the anchor points that they correspond to. So at the shoulder, we want the puppet pin to occupy the same position as the anchor point for the arm. And then the pin for the wrist should also occupy the same position as the anchor point for the wrist on the hand. So because we won't be able to see both anchor points when we have the arm selected, we need to just really quick make some guides to make sure we get this in the right position. I'm going to go ahead and mark both positions just to make this easy. So I'm going to zoom in, turn on rulers, and we'll bring a guide down for that shoulder anchor point, and I'm going to zoom in quite a bit to make sure that we're right on top of it. And then now we're going to select the wrist or hand. Just want to make a mental note that that line is a bit to the right of the shoulder line, so I can remember which is which. And then while we're doing the puppet tool, let's actually turn off the hand and fingers and just focus on that arm layer here. So I'm going to grab my puppet pin tool. As usual, expansion at 20, triangles at 1500, and we're going to start by adding that first pin right on that anchor point. Then we want to kind of eyeball where the elbow should be. I'm going to say right about in here, do about right there. And then again, our wrist position here is just a bit to the right and right there. So I want to hit that as close as possible. Let's go ahead and name our pins. Notice that for the first time here I've introduced something other than just upper, lower arm or hand, and I've actually named this pin the wrist. Now it will actually drive the hand artwork here, but we already have an E right hand. I really like to make sure and differentiate these things when I've got these situations where I've got sort of multiple objects that are kind of occupying the same position or referencing a similar body part. So in this case, on the pin names here, I've got the arm up pin, the arm lower pin, and the wrist pin. And remember, it's occupying the same position as the anchor point for the hand artwork. Okay, let's go ahead and add bones to these. So there's our bones. And now we can go ahead and parent these all up. So in your particular case, you could have any combination of different hand pieces, finger pieces, thumb pieces, whatever your individual situation is, parent those as needed. In this case, obviously, we're parenting the fingers to the hand art. And then whatever situation your hand and finger and thumb art is in, however many layers, however they're parented, whatever is the top of that chain, which in this case is the hand artwork, then is parented to that wrist null. Then the wrist null is parented to the lower arm null to the upper arm null, and then we're going to take the artwork of the arm and parent that to the upper arm null. Now we just need to go ahead and make a controller. So we want the controller to occupy the same position as the wrist. So let's select the wrist null. We'll create a controller and we'll rename it. And we'll resize it so it sits nicer around that hand. And adjust the anchor point to position it. It needs to be a little bigger, I guess. Kind of seems like a square, seems sort of right for this particular hand. Okay, let's just zero out that value, and then let's just move it over a little bit. So again, we have kind of an intuitive click and drag there. Now we're ready to set up our IK chain. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to focus just on the bone nulls, not the artwork. The artwork is parented into this system, but we're going to put our chain on these three layers. So once again, from the bottom of the chain to the top, so wrist, lower arm, upper arm, and then controller. We hit the IK script and select two-layer IK with goal as always. Okay, let's check our work. We should first turn our resolution down. Let me grab the arrow tool here. All right, cool, that's looking nice. And again, because we're not stressing out that mesh too much, we're getting pretty good curvature there. And again, there's no weird wiggle on the arm as we pose the hand. So great, that's a pretty nice posable arm there. Let's undo back and let's zero out this controller, because if we're going to add some starch here, we want to be able to get back to zero. So let's zero that guy out, and then let's go ahead and put a little starch in and try to alleviate a little bit of that pinching like we did with the other rig. Now we're going to have a little bit of a harder time here because of the thickness of this arm. Thicker arms are harder to deal with, or thicker limbs, I should say, arms or legs, a little harder to deal with in terms of pinching and getting smooth curvature with a wide range of motion. So I'm going to select the arm layer, then we're going to grab our starch tool, And we want the starch way down again, so let's try the number it's already in here that we used in the other rig, the 0.05, that worked well to create the nice curvature on the hipster guy. And we'll try squirting a little starch right in there. Okay, and that helped. We definitely alleviated some pinching there. Let's move it around a little, see what seems to work best. Generally, you want to kind of center it around the joint for the most part. Wonder if I turn it up more. Yeah. Let's try it in movement here. Always got to try actually playing with it and seeing how it performs as you're animating and moving. That's really quite nice. Great, great. All right. Now again, we could starch this so we had a crisp elbow, but I think this character in particular really wants to have plenty of curvature and kind of rubber hose feeling, and of course the nice stretchiness that we get from using the puppet tool. As always, let's do our cleanup. So I'm going to go ahead and close that up. We'll leave the solo buttons on. Let's lock pretty much everything just to be safe here. And we want to toggle shying on for everything except the controller. And let's get rid of the visibility of these null objects here. We don't need to look at those. And now we can hit the shy button and clean that up. And then, as always, let's lock up our properties that we don't need for this controller. There we go. Oh, and I should mention, we could easily have added rigging for these fingers, but we're going to do a whole lesson on hands, so let's kind of hold off on that. But we've already looked at how we can add rotation to the fingers. We could add that into this system easily enough. All right, so now this particular combination of a jointed hand and a puppet-tooled arm is probably the one you're going to find the most useful. But you are going to run into those situations where you want the opposite. In other words, you want a jointed upper and lower arm, but for whatever reason you want to puppet tool the wrist and hand. So let's go ahead and build that kind of rig for this hipster woman. And you can see here we've already got things kind of prepped and set up for this. So to start with, we have combined the hand and the fingers and the notorious cuff all together on this lower arm, all together within this one lower arm layer. So we can puppet tool that whole thing. And then the upper arm, of course, is its own separate piece. Just like with any limb rigging, we want to start here by setting some anchor points. So let's turn our right hand guides on there. And we want to set these anchor points logically for jointing. So the upper arm here, we want to snap to this shoulder. And it looks like that guide is just a titch off. But because of the way this character is built, we don't really need a perfectly circular overlap up in the shoulder. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. And let's go ahead and just snap that anchor point in there to the shoulder for that upper arm. And then the lower arm, of course, we want that at the elbow. Now, because we're mixing the puppet tool with jointing, we want to create some guides here to make sure that we can line everything up. And we want to create guides for the elbow and for the wrist. So let's unlock this guy. Now let's add our puppet pins. I'm going to turn off the markers now, and we're going to grab the puppet pin tool. And let's just solo just the artwork we're working with here. First pin up at the elbow. Second pin down by the wrist. And then we want a pin to rotate the hand. And then a pin to bend the fingers. Okay, let's go ahead and name our pins. Add bones. And then let's parent this up. So to parent up this kind of chain, it's going to be just a little different here. Once again, we want to parent all of the finger and thumb and various hand parts together as needed depending on your particular situation. So we're doing fingertips to fingers, fingers to hand. And then because the lower arm artwork now is being driven by the puppet pins, we're going to keep working with those until we jump to the upper arm. So we're going to go from the hand null to the lower arm null. And then the lower arm null will be parented up to the upper arm. And the lower arm artwork we will parent also to the lower arm null, so that the artwork will come along with the puppet pins as they slide that artwork around. So it's important to note that our IK chain is going to go like this. It's going to go hand, lower arm, upper arm, and then the controller, right? So that's where our chain is going to be. If these layers are going to be the base of our IK chain, they have to be parented one to another. You can parent other things in and around them, but you have to have this uninterrupted chain, hand to lower arm, hand null to lower arm null to upper arm artwork. So let's add a controller and add our IK. So we're going to select the hand, create a controller, size that up, position it for easy click and drag, rename it, and let's build our IK chain. Hand null, lower arm null, upper arm artwork, controller. IK, two-layer IK with goal. All right, let's test this out. Yeah, there we go. So we have our nice crisp joint. Notice there's a little drifting there. We're going to need to work on that with some starch. And we definitely have our puppet tooled lower arm here. So there's obviously some starching that needs to be done. So let's go ahead and starch this up so these joints work a little better. Since we've kind of already done a fair amount of starching, I'm just going to speed through this, and you'll be able to see me shape this starching up as I go, but we'll let it go a little quicker with less commentary. Oh, but before we get any starch on here, we better zero out our controller because we're going to have to wiggle this around and test it a lot. So since I have guides here, I can actually just snap to that guide, so that's sort of handy, and then let's go ahead and zero that guy out. And then once again we can return to a kind of a bent pose here, and we can start working on starching that arm. Well, I didn't get it quite perfect, but I got a pretty good deformation here, a pretty nice curve into that hand, and then I made sure there was some overlap tool on that cuff so the cuff overlaps. Now I know we haven't talked about the overlap tool yet, which is part of the puppet tool system. We're going to look at the overlap tool and some more advanced starching in the arms bonus lesson following this lesson. Now we are getting some counter bending in the lower arm. I decided to accept that in return for having a nice line and no pinching happening here in the wrist. So again, some limitations and some trade-offs. That's kind of the way it's going to be. There's also a little bit of the bottom of this elbow poking out here. It means our anchor points or our guides were maybe not exactly right on, or we didn't get our puppet pin exactly in the right place. It just shows you need to be extra precise when working with these puppet tool jointing combinations. This is again not a super common choice, but it is a choice that you can make, and there are going to be times when it's going to be the only choice. This may not even be the best choice for this particular situation. The idea again is that I want you to learn a lot of different techniques and some of the pros and cons. When you approach specific rigging problems, you'll have a lot of tools in your toolkit to try to solve those problems. I also went ahead and added some finger movement here and put a little starching in there to just make that work a little better. Overall, a pretty nice posable arm. Okay, let's finish and kind of clean up here. First, we want to turn off the null objects that we don't need to see. We want to lock everything except the controller. We want to shy everything except the controller. And let's just hide our guides for now. We don't really need to see those as well. And then let's go ahead and hit the shy button. And then let's lock the properties that we don't need. To finish out our rig. Now, one of the things that we've lost by going with jointing here in the upper and lower arm is the ability to stretch. I've just disengaged stretching here because we can't do it because the puppet tool is only on the lower part of the arm. The upper arm cannot stretch. Even if I enabled stretching here, it would just come apart. So the last rig I'm going to show you gives us some of the best of both worlds. The crisp elbows and knees of jointing with the option of stretching that you get with the puppet tool. The first two rigs we looked at I consider combination rigs. Part is jointed and part is puppet tooled. This last technique I refer to as a blended joint rig. Please understand that these are my own terms and are not meant to be definitive or scientific or anything. It's just an easier way for me to talk about these different rigging techniques. So let's look at an example of a blended joint rig, and then we'll make one. Okay, let's have a look at this farmer man here. I've got his left arm here rigged up with a blended joint rig. And let's take a look at what we have. So if I pick up and move the arm, and here we can turn this down a little bit. If we pick up and move this arm around, you can see that we've got the nice, beautiful, crisp joint that we would get with a jointed rig. But we're getting this really nice geometric look, which is quite nice with the vector character. But we also get this lovely stretching capability, which is really handy for cartoony movements, or sometimes just when you need to cheat a little bit, sometimes that comes in really handy. And then the other thing that makes this stretchy quality really handy is the auxiliary elbow and knee controls I told you about earlier, and we'll show you later in the course. This is a very nice rig setup because you do get a little bit of the best of both worlds. But this isn't an easy one to put together. It's fairly fussy, and the parenting structure can be a little bit of a brain teaser. So let's go ahead and take a look at building a blended joint rig. Let's hop over to the suit woman here, and let's start by just soloing the layers that we want to work with. And we're going to need some markers here to snap to. So let's go ahead and convert this Illustrator layer to vector shapes. And I'm also going to make these multiplies so we can see through them a little bit. Let's lock that up. And we'll start by setting our anchor points just like we would with a jointed setup. Oop, I got to zoom in on that hand. There we go. A little suspicious about the rotation of that hand. Let's have a look at that. Oh, that actually works pretty good. It's not a huge range of motion. It breaks down a little bit right in there, but that's not too bad. Alright, just like with the other combinations of jointing and using the puppet tool, we need to mark out some guides to mark where all of our anchor points are. In this case, we want to be extra precise in order to get these joints to look as good as possible. Okay, we have to make kind of a mental note that the first line in this little row of 3 is for the elbow. The line all the way on the right is for the shoulder, and the middle line is for the wrist. Now that we've got our markers in place, let's go ahead and apply our puppet tools. Now, the unique thing about this particular rig is that we are going to put a puppet tool on each part rather than one whole arm. And we're really only taking advantage of its ability to stretch, not its ability to bend. So we're only going to be putting 2 pins on each part. So let's start with the upper arm and just do these piece by piece. I'm going to grab the puppet pin tool, and we'll start as close as we can get here to being right on that anchor point. And then down here for the elbow. Oops, a little bit off there. There we go. Sometimes you gotta hit it a couple times to get it right on there. We need it to be as precise as possible. Alright, and next we'll select the lower arm, and we're going to try to hit that exact same spot here. And then down here at the wrist. Even though it's actually off the artwork, we still want these to sync up as much as possible. For now, we'll leave the hand as just a single art piece. We won't put the puppet tool on there, but you could potentially put a couple of puppet pins on the hand in order to bend the hand. We'll just use it as is for this rig here. Okay. Now let's go ahead and name our pins. Now here we have to be extra careful because, again, remember, we want everything to have its own unique name. We also want to be able to fairly easily identify these different parts. And we're now going to have 2 pins for each limb part. So we have to differentiate those from the artwork and each other. Okay, so notice that I included the overall part, the lower arm, in the name arm low, and then I used the joint name rather than the part name. So this is the lower arm elbow, the lower arm wrist, the upper arm elbow, and the upper arm shoulder. Now notice that we have 2 elbows. Okay? We have an elbow for the lower arm and an elbow for the upper arm that meet and join in the middle here. And this is why we have to be very, very careful of our naming so we don't accidentally duplicate names. Okay, let's add bones to these. And now we can close these up. And we should turn our hand on too, since we're ready to start putting this together. Now first, let's reorder things just a little bit here to give it just a little more logic. We've already got kind of upper arm, lower arm, hand in descending order, which is nice because it kind of reflects what's actually happening in spatially here. But we don't always get this luxury because we have to go by whatever layering makes the artwork look correct. And sometimes you're going to have the lower arm on top of the upper, and sometimes vice versa. It's going to depend. So since we have the luxury, let's go ahead and reorder these in a little more of a logical way. So let's put the artwork for the upper arm at the very top here, and then we'll do the upper arm shoulder null, the upper arm elbow null, then we'll do the lower arm artwork, the lower arm elbow null, lower arm wrist null, and then the hand. Now again, you won't always be able to order your artwork like this. You're going to have to go with what the artwork requires. Now parenting for blended joints is definitely tricky, and it's not particularly intuitive. There's actually 2 or 3 combinations that'll work. I'm going to show you the one I use most often, and quite honestly, I usually have to look at notes before I do this myself. Again, it gets confusing making sure that you have the stretching capability and the 2 elbow pieces work together correctly. It's a bit of a brain teaser. But let's walk through it slowly, and we also have step-by-step notes in the PDF so that you shouldn't have too much trouble recreating this joint on your own. So we're going to start by parenting the artwork to that top shoulder null, because remember, we want the artwork to kind of follow along with that. and avoid stressing out the mesh more than we have to. And let's do the same thing with the lower arm art. Let's parent that to the lower arm elbow. Now once we've done that, we can kind of forget about these two layers entirely. In fact, if it helps you to think your way through this, you could even shy them. I'm not going to bother, but you could even shy them away if it just helps you concentrate on the structure of the parenting here. All right, let's start from the bottom up now that we've got that artwork taken care of. I'm going to start with the hand art, and we're going to parent that to the lower arm wrist null. Then we're going to parent the lower arm wrist null to the upper arm elbow null. So we're jumping all the way to that upper arm elbow null. And now remember, we have to create a 3-layer parenting chain for our IK to work. So this is our parenting chain from the lower arm wrist to the upper arm elbow to the upper arm shoulder. There's our 3 layers, okay? Now we still have to deal with this additional layer, the lower arm elbow. Now in order for the lower arm elbow to follow along with the elbow that is part of our IK chain, go ahead and parent the lower arm elbow to the upper arm elbow. I'll pull this out just so you guys can see the pattern here. So let's go ahead and create a controller. I'm going to select the wrist null, hit the controller button, size that. Actually, now that I look at it, 300 by 300 square kind of works. Let's just try that. And we'll rename our controller. And now we'll build our IK chain. We're going from the bottom to the top and then selecting the controller. So the bottom of our chain is the lower arm wrist, then the upper arm elbow, upper arm shoulder, and then the controller. Get our 2-layer IK with goal, and let's see how this is working. Okay, we have to reverse the orientation there. Let's see if we get that nice stretch. Hey, there it is. That's looking really good. When you do these blended joints, there is kind of a specific way you're going to starch. So let's undo back here, get that orientation the right direction. And let's zero out our controller. And just to kind of see better what we're doing, I'm going to turn multiply on this upper arm layer so we can see that overlap. And then you can see as we're pulling on this, you can see that we're not really getting very nice joint once this stretches out. Here, let's turn the resolution up a little. Yeah, you see? It's not quite as good as it could be, and this is where we need to do our starching. So let's take care of that starching now. I'm going to select the upper arm first, and then grab the starch tool. And what we want to do here is just squirt a regular 1% amount of starch right around that circular overlap and just fill that in. And we want to be fairly snug around it, particularly if our artwork has texture, because this is going to hold this part steady, this part here, excuse me, this part steady, but we want everything else to stretch, and if it's got a gradient or a texture on it, you don't want too much of it to be stiff. So let's get that kind of tucked in there like so. And you can already see that's improved things. Let's go ahead and get the same on the other arm here. There, and you see how that suddenly popped that into place, and now we're getting that same overlap even in this distressed, stretched state here. And then also look what's happening here with the hand. We're also losing some of that. So let's put a squirt down at the end and look at how that snapped that right back into shape. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is some at the top of the shoulder here. See how that repositioned the shoulder, and that way we won't be getting slippage, particularly if we have a kind of a tight overlap we're trying to maintain with our rig. Okay, let's go back. And now you can see that even with the full stretching, we're keeping the joints much, much cleaner. See how as I stretch, that shoulder stays in place, the circular overlap on our elbow stays in place. So that's a really critical thing to making this work, is getting those blobs of starch right over those overlaps. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. So as usual, let's go ahead and do our cleanup. I'm going to turn these guides off, and we're going to lock everything, and we're going to shy everything except the controller. Let's get rid of these nulls that we don't need to look at. Hit our shy button, and then let's lock our properties to finish up. Alright, now this is a really cool rig because of this great combination of the stretching and the beautiful crisp joint you get with jointing. For those of you that took Character Animation Boot Camp, most of the characters had these joints. As you can see, the parenting gets a little bit gnarly, but it's not that bad if you kind of think it through step by step. Now move on to the exercise video and take a look at what we have set up for you.